But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Sanctions have so far been ineffective, with the DPRK's launch of yet another ballistic missile. Donald Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly threatened that the US would totally destroy the DPRK if it attacked either the US or its allies. How likely is it that war? Trump referred to Kim Jung Un as Rocket Man in his speech. What will the unpredictable US president's next move be as the nuclear crisis continues? Trump thanked China, Russia and other members of the Security Council for supporting sanctions against the DPRK. The nuclear crisis is a topic that cannot be avoided when he visits China in November. What can China do to help cool the situation? South Korean President Moon Jae-in is expected to hold a trilateral meeting with Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on the sidelines of the UNGA session. What can we expect from this meeting? How far apart are the views and attitudes of the three sides towards the DPRK nuclear issue?
The United Nations General Assembly opened in New York on Tuesday, with the Korean Peninsula tensions a topic topping the agenda. Both U.S. President Donald Trump and South Korean President Moon Jae-in are scheduled to meet to make their debut address to the United Nations. What messages will the two leaders send? And how coordinated will their approach be? Will the UN continue to rely on sanctions against Pyongyang, or will the U.S. force military action? To answer these questions and more, we are happy to be joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor Bruce Cummings, former chair of the History Department at the University of Chicago, and Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. We shall also speak to Professor Jun Ho Kim at Dankook University, South Korea, via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. First of all, Bruce, do you think President Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly will help North Korea instead of deterring this regime?
Well, actually, I think it was a terrible speech. It was completely irresponsible for the greatest power on earth to threaten the total destruction of a small country like North Korea. Furthermore, what Donald Trump doesn't seem to know is that during the Korean War, the U.S. Air Force already did this, totally destroying just about every city in North Korea, something few Americans know about, but every North Korean still is educated about from the earliest age. So it was a very irresponsible speech, and I don't think it does anything but help Kim Jung Un, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him respond with another missile test in the next few days.
President Trump's speech followed Secretary General Antonio Guterres' plea for an end to inflammatory statements. What do you think of the exchange of the crossfire between the United States and the DPRK? Will that fuel the tensions on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, definitely. I think it's a very concerned development, and it would certainly not help the calm down the tension between DPRK on the one hand and the U.S. and the other. I fully agree with the professor's remark. This is an irresponsible way to handle a crisis, an issue like that. For me, it is a dangerous way. I think the United States as the sole superpower, and for a president making a maiden speech at the UN, and which I think the very purpose of this institution, of this organization, is to advance peace and to rid the scourge of war. So I thought it is very irresponsible and dangerous way for a country, for a president of a country, to talk about that.
Nikki Haley, the American ambassador to the United Nations, or spokesperson of the State Department or the White House, all of them said all options are on the table, including the use of force. Does it mean that a war is imminent?
I don't think there's any military solution to the problems of the Korean Peninsula, and there never has been. Going back to the Korean War, the United States invaded North Korea in October 1950 and ended up in a war with China, and were basically kicked out of North Korea in about 2 weeks in one of the great debacles in American foreign policy. I think American leaders should have learned then that there's no real military solution in Korea. But diplomacy and wise politics is the only way to deal with North Korea.
Let me go to Professor Kim. Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Your President Moon Jae-in will deliver a speech at the UN General Assembly. What would be the major points concerning the Korean Peninsula?
Yes, the problem is that now our situation is not too good. So Moon Jae-in make some address at United Nations. Perhaps he talking about the Korean problems. What is the solution between South and North? Perhaps he insists. Perhaps we wanted to keep the chance to exchange internal peninsula together. And the other problem we also say about the sanctions, strong sanctions against North Korea, because the problem is not easy to solve nowadays. So many Korean scholars and specialists said that the missiles and atomic bombs is already perhaps the 90% is already achieved the goal. So we should make more strong sanctions against North Korea. Also have to cooperate with United States and China and Japan and Russia also.
Rong Ying, as scheduled, President Trump will meet with his South Korean counterpart on the of the United Nations General Assembly. Do you think they will advance the agenda of a joint military maneuver? Will that be more provocative for Pyongyang?
I think the top on the agenda would be the two presidents to certainly, coordinate policies. Particularly, I think for the United States would hope or would force South Korean, the new president, would come on same page. Because remember, a few days ago, President Trump did talked about the so-called appeasement of South Korea's policy towards North Korea.
Such rhetoric will certainly be very unfriendly for South Korea to accept. It's a bitter pill. So don't you think there's going to be very serious disputes between these two allies?
I don't think they will dispute it. What I think we're going to see is that, at least in the public sort of domain, in public speech or statement, President Moon would have to show that they are in same page with President Trump or the United States, because they are allies. They always want to show that they're ironclad relations and no division. But as we know that President Moon came to office with agenda different from the previous administration, and arguing that only peace, only diplomacy and dialogue would solve the problem. And he also hoped that there are more reconciliation between the two sides, that South Korea would have a more sort of a leading role to play in terms of solving the issues, maintain peace.
So long as I'm concerned, Professor Moon Jae-in is a student of the father of the Sanctions policy of the DPRK, of the RK. But he seems to have closed the door for any negotiations in the foreseeable future. What do you think of a trilateral meeting between Trump, Abe, and President Moon? Allies of the United States, Japan, and South Korea have been on loggerheads over the issue of comfort women. They don't talk to each other very often. So what do you think of the common agenda, if any?
Well, the previous president who was impeached, President Park, actually refused to talk to Abe for years because of the comfort women issue. Abe has gone out of his way, bent over backwards to try and have a good relationship with Donald Trump. And people say they're great friends and they have a wonderful relationship. Who really knows? I think Moon Jae-in, as was just said, is in a very difficult position because his own policies toward the North are quite different than Trump's, particularly when he was campaigning, but also now. And also, to be on the same page with Donald Trump is very difficult because on Tuesday he changes the page, and then on Wednesday he changes it back. And so it's an acrobatic act to be on the same page with Donald Trump for any foreign leader. But for Donald Trump to call President Moon an appeaser when President Moon just got into office. Furthermore, you may remember Trump also said, "I told you so," as if Trump is the expert on Korea. I actually respect Moon Jae-in very much. He was chief of staff under Roh Moo-hyun. He's a very experienced man. He's very calm, measured, wise. I think he's doing his utmost to try and get along with Donald Trump, but it's not an easy job.
How difficult is it for the United States to use force? What is the red line?
I'm not sure the red line is, even though I think the United States
You don't
have
think
tried.
there is a red line?
I think there's a red line, but I don't think.
What is it?
I don't think U.S. is able to present or convince that the DPRK that this is that. I think the other day I read a very interesting sort of a picture, seeing a picture that literally to the flag of the national flag of the United States, and on just the two opposite sides, one President Trump, and the other Kim Jung Un. Then Kim Jong Un was asking that. President Trump said we have deadline. Then Kim Jong Un was looking at so many lines. Then which one is the deadline? So this this picture, sort of cartoon shows that even though we know, and also even though I think the United States made it very clear they have a deadline, and I think it is very difficult to convince, I think, or present to DPRK in a way that.
Is that the policy of ambiguity, Bruce?
Well, I mean, there has been a red line for 25 years, ever since North Korea was suspected of having atomic weapons. That really was back in the early 1990s. In 1995, General Colin Powell said that if North Korea used a nuclear weapon in anger, the U.S. would turn North Korea into a charcoal briquette. And that has a particular resonance for North Koreans because many of them use charcoal briquettes to heat their homes. And Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, also said if North Korea used a nuclear weapon, the U.S. would wipe them out. So what is new about Donald Trump is not these kinds of red line threats that the United States has been very clear about. What's new about Trump is his waffling, his back and forth, and his incendiary rhetoric about fire and fury and destroying North Korea.
Professor Kim, what do you make of President Trump's rhetoric on fire and fury? What's your understanding about the red line we've been discussing here in the Beijing studio?
Yeah, red line perhaps I think is some different. Perhaps the North Korea attacked South Korea or United States or rise, including United States territories, is a red line. So this time the red line is one of the rhetoric problem. The speech of Donald Trump and United Nations, the main target perhaps focused to China, it's not North Korea. Also, he wanted to negotiate with South Korea and Japan also. So there is some meeting. Trump also wanted to make some high-level business positions and to sell some weapons and negotiate some FTA agreements again. So the main problem of Donald Trump is it looked like business negotiation style. So press some sanctions to North Korea, and the main target is negotiate with China, Korea, and Japan. And the main target of Donald Trump is perhaps America first. So the aim is the benefit of United States. The red line is one of the rhetoric problems. It cannot pass by North Korea, or we cannot attack North Korea also.
Ever since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, 52 American hostages were taken by Iranians, and ever since the invasion of Iraq in the early 1990s, the desert Operation Desert Storm, severe sanctions have been imposed on both countries, Iran and Iraq. casualties were, first of all, the civilians were the first brunt of the casualties, and therefore we have the food for oil scandal, quote unquote, at the United Nations. Kofi Annan was criticized for this controversial case. This time around, the UN Security Council seems to have exhausted all means about economic sanctions, and that's why Nikki Haley, the U.S. Special Envoy to the United Nations, said she would hand over this case to the Pentagon for a military solution. Let's take a closer look at the impact of economic sanctions. Will that pay off?
I'm not sure. I mean, the sanctions would, in the end, playing a role that's so effective will force DPRK to give up or change its position on developing its nuclear and missile program. And I always said, sanction itself is only the mean, not the end. We have to follow. I mean, offer or incentives of dialogue. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the UN security resolutions, I mean, it is literally there that while the purpose of a sanction is to punish a country like DPRK, to pursue a nuclear and missile program against the rule. While in the meantime, they should also followed up with dialogues. So it's very unfortunate. I mean, being talking about only sanctions. And the track record of similar cases, I mean, we're talking about Iran's nuclear case and others. They say, why? Of course, now we also have problems. And President Trump is talking about, I mean, possibly a backup from that deal. But that's a different story. But if we had some successful sort of a case of that, then I think it all goes on two ways: sanctions, and then incentives and disincentives. Sanctions and also offer of diplomacy or dialogue.
China refuses to cut off completely our oil supply to North Korea, citing the reason of humanitarian crisis to back up our argument. Do you think this makes sense? Russians and China take the same position that economic sanctions would only be counterproductive, and we would offer to use veto should such a bill on complete and comprehensive suspension of oil supply to the DPRK be approved by the UN Security Council. What do you think of the pressure that is building up on China?
Well, I think it was a big success for the United States to get China and Russia on board with these latest sanctions, cutting oil and also embargoing textile exports from North Korea. I also agree with what you said, that China doesn't want to strangle North Korea and see it collapse. But I think President Putin actually put it best last week when he said that North Koreans will eat grass before they will give up their nuclear weapons and missiles. And that's because they see this as a life and death matter of regime survival. They know exactly what happened to Saddam Hussein. They know what happened to Gaddafi in Libya. And they have said just over and over again since 2003, this is not going to happen to us. If Saddam Hussein had a nuclear bomb, he'd still be in power.
There is a strong voice coming out of Beijing that says, well, the current standoff between the DPRK and the United States is and will be, first of all, their own issue, not a threat to China. However, there is a strong voice at the same time that is delivered by the editorials of Global Times, which is the most influential Chinese media for the overseas observers, which says the nuclear fallout that may come out of the nuclear facility, which is not very far from our border in Dongbei, the three northern provinces of China, would be a serious and genuine threat to the security of Chinese nationals in the neighboring province of the DPRK. Do you think this is a real threat? And what would be done by the Chinese government in response to any of such emergency situations?
Well, I think the argument that this is an issue, I mean, the nuclear issue, DPRK, nuclear issue is an issue between the US and DPRK, I think is, if I understand correctly, is that because this issue in the end, at the core of this issue is the security. The security perception, threat and the security perception. That is why I think, because from the Chinese DPRK perspective, China is not threatening DPRK. The only threat or perceived threat is from the United States, vis-a-vis for US. So I think China has been arguing that the core issue of security and the key to this question, this issue, is between the relationship, or it's an interaction between DPRK and US and the US. While the China had always, I think, been very much proactive and constructive, play a role to bring the side together.
But six-party talks has failed.
Well, I think the six parties failed has not been successful so far is because it has not been followed up the agreement has not been followed. I mean, comprehensively and completely in a way as expected.
What do you make of the allegation on the nuclear fallout on the periphery of the Chinese territory? I mean, it's so close to our border.
It is a big issue, and it is an issue that is sort of impacting China's safety and security, and also particularly the region neighboring DPRK. That's why I think we take it as an issue. Very serious issue, and that's why I think China has played a very important role. In the meantime, I think it also touched upon the issue of non-proliferation. I mean, and also it has geopolitical implications for the region. So China is working very hard whenever there's a tension.
But the issue is that DPRK is not a party to the NPT. Right.
It was.
It was.
People forget that in the 1990s, the DPRK was a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and their plutonium was frozen completely from 1994 to 2002 by the Clinton administration with some very, I think, very sophisticated diplomacy. George W. Bush quite stupidly kicked that agreement over. And now I'm afraid Donald Trump may stupidly kick the Iran inspection regime over. And so you have two Republican presidents who just don't subscribe even to multinational arrangements such as that with North Korea in the 1990s and Iran today.
Let me go to Professor Kim again for his comments on whether China is the only victim of the latest missile test by the DPRK, because ROK has been able to deploy all of the batteries of the THAAD programs despite our strong protests. So it's a big success for President Moon Jae-in. The United States, President Trump was able to divert public attention from domestic political agenda to external threats, creating an enemy in what is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe would use this alleged threat from the DPRK to rewrite the pacifist constitution and to call an early election of the Japanese Congress to sort of reinforce its own power base. So China seems to be the only victim of the latest missile test. What do you think, Professor Kim?
Yes, I think it's one of the big problems because in the field of geopolitical area in Northeast Asia, China is one of the very serious situation against North Korea's nuclear weapons development. But in historical area, China also controlled the other border countries before, also have their own way. So this time, China should negotiate with North Korea also. Cannot embargo to supply oil to North Korea, but China can control North Korea also. And on the other hand, China also negotiate with United States. For example, the trading problem and the financial problem and area safety problem, security problem also. But the other one, the main point is that around the South problems between China and Korea, we have some problems between two countries. But focusing on North Korea's nuclear weapons development and some crises around Northeast Asia countries and in the world, China should also cooperate with Korea. Korea government also listen to Chinese government's the intending and their strategy together. Otherwise, you cannot solve North Korea problems. In geographic problems, United States is the other side country. But in this area, China, Japan, Korea, Russia should cooperate together. 6 table talks is not ended yet. So should find the other method make look like 6 table talks. Otherwise, we cannot solve this problem.
Thank you so much,
Every
Professor
time
Kim. Thank you.
We have some problems.
Well, yes, you do have tons of problems about this issue, but China has strong reasons to question their analysis, which says China could exercise control. We have a tremendous influence on the DPRK, but China says not necessarily so.
Well, DPRK is a sovereign state. DPRK and has already have, I think, kind of capabilities of nuclear and missiles, which is very proud of, and which we all agree that this is really touched upon. It's sort of existential issues and life and death issues. So I think for China, actually, we can do either way. 2 options. Both of them, I think, are very bad. Either we can offer kind of assurance, security assurance, say, look, if you don't do this, if you do that, and then your security will be guaranteed. And the DPRK will not going to accept, because they only believe they themselves can responsible for their security, and they feel they already have the capability, which they feel they can. On the other hand, we can say we threaten them with security, but in the end, this is again not in the interest of China. And in the end, I think that for DPRK, what they are asking at the moment is a security. I mean, the United States government is not honored. So now with this administration, they are
comprehensively and strictly executing the details of the sanctions. So what else can China do? I mean, do you trust that China will faithfully honor our commitment to the UN resolution?
In one aspect of China that America continually overlook is that ever since China normalized relations with the U.S. and joined the United Nations in the 1970s, China has been a very strict adherent to international law. They promote the rule of law internationally. And in this case, I think China is bending over backward to try and show the United States that it also believes the North Korean nuclear program is a big problem. Meanwhile, Trump turns around and mixes up trade with this issue. Never happened before. For 30 years, always, U.S.-China trade was on a separate track from security. So he doesn't seem to reciprocate. But I'd like to say just one more thing, if there's time. We've overlooked what Kim Jung Un said yesterday, the day before, that he wanted to reach.
Thank you so much. Well, time is up. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.